A few years ago, I was visiting my cousin Daniel, who lived on a remote farm. It wasn't one of those picturesque places you see in movies. This farm was isolated, surrounded by miles of fields and dense woods. I decided to spend a weekend there to help him out with some work and to get away from the city. The first day went by uneventfully, but that night, something strange happened. Around midnight, I woke up to use the bathroom and noticed faint lights coming from the barn. It was odd because Daniel and I had turned off all the lights before heading to bed. I peeked out the window and saw the glow moving around inside, like someone was walking with a lantern. I assumed Daniel had gone out for some reason, so I went back to bed. The next morning, I casually asked him about it, and he gave me a confused look. He swore he hadn't left the house all night. He even joked that maybe one of the cows was learning to use a flashlight. That night, I decided to stay up late to see if it would happen again. Sure enough, around the same time, the lights appeared in the barn. This time I decided to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly made my way outside. As I approached the barn, the lights suddenly went out. I stood there, scanning the area, but I didn't see or hear anything unusual. The barn was completely dark and silent. Feeling uneasy, I decided to go back inside. I told Daniel what happened the next morning, and he looked concerned. He said that he'd seen the lights a few times himself over the years, but always assumed it was just his imagination. He brushed it off, but I could tell it bothered him. On my last night at the farm, Daniel and I stayed up late talking. He told me about the history of the property and how it had been in his family for generations. He mentioned that there was an old, unused well near the barn that his grandfather had sealed up years ago. It was supposedly cursed. Or, at least, that's what the family legend claimed. The idea of a cursed well seemed ridiculous, but after what I'd seen, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this place. Around midnight, the lights appeared again. This time, both Daniel and I saw them, moving erratically in the barn. Without saying a word, we grabbed flashlights and went outside together. When we got to the barn, the lights disappeared, just like before. But this time, we noticed something we hadn't before. The faint sound of whispering coming from near the old well. It was so quiet that we could barely make it out, but it was definitely there. We approached the well cautiously, and as we got closer, the whispering grew louder. Daniel shined his flashlight on the well's cover, and we both froze. The heavy wooden planks that sealed the well had been moved, leaving a small gap. Neither of us could explain how that was possible. The cover had been nailed down years ago, and no one had touched it since. I leaned in to look, and the whispering stopped. In the silence, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Daniel grabbed my arm and insisted we go back inside. We didn't talk about it for the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed up and left the farm, eager to put the whole experience behind me. A few weeks later, Daniel called me. He said he'd hired someone to reseal the well and hadn't seen the lights since. But he also admitted he didn't feel comfortable living there anymore. He ended up selling the farm not long after. I still think about that weekend sometimes, especially when I see an old farmhouse or a barn. I don't know what was really going on out there, but one thing is certain: whatever was in that well wasn't meant to be disturbed. A few years ago, I was hired by a small farm owner named George to help with harvesting. His farm was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by endless fields of corn and wheat. It was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you notice every little sound. George was an older man, quiet but friendly. and he warned me about working too late. He said the fields could be disorienting at night. I figured he was just trying to scare me into keeping a strict schedule, but I soon realized he wasn't joking. On the second night, I stayed late in the barn to finish stacking hay bales. Around 9 p.m., I noticed movement in the cornfield. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I saw a shadow, tall and human-like, moving between the stalks. It wasn't George. He had gone to bed an hour earlier. I grabbed a flashlight and called out, thinking maybe someone had wandered onto the property. The shadow didn't respond. Instead, it froze, then darted deeper into the field. I decided not to follow it. Something about the way it moved didn't feel right. I locked up the barn and went inside, pretending I hadn't seen anything. The next morning, I told George about it. He didn't seem surprised. He just told me to be careful and avoid the fields at night. His tone was serious, almost like a warning. That night, I made sure to finish my work early, but as I was heading back to the house, I heard footsteps. Soft, but deliberate, coming from the cornfield. I froze and shined my flashlight toward the sound, but I didn't see anything. I quickened my pace and didn't look back. The next day, George asked me to check on the scarecrows in the fields. He said one of them looked like it had fallen over. When I got there, I realized he was right. The scarecrow near the edge of the property was lying on the ground, its tattered clothes scattered around it. Oddly, the wooden frame it was mounted on with force. The force of the mounted person had cut the feelings, limbs, and power of its will. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the shadow I'd seen and the broken scarecrow. Around midnight, I heard something outside my window, a soft tapping sound. When I looked out, I didn't see anything at first, but then I noticed movement near the barn. The shadow was back, and it wasn't alone. There were two now, moving toward the house. I woke George, but by the time we looked outside, they were gone. He didn't seem surprised and just muttered something about keeping them out. He refused to elaborate, but I could tell he knew more than he was letting on. The following day, I told George I wanted to leave. He didn't argue. Before I left, he handed me an envelope with my payment and told me to stay out of the fields at night, no matter where I ended up working. A few months later, I found out George had sold the farm. When I asked around, I heard rumors that he'd seen the same shadows for years but never talked about them. Some people said the land was cursed, while others thought it was just George's way of scaring off trespassers. To this day, I don't know what I saw in those fields, but every time I hear the rustling of leaves or see a scarecrow in the distance, I can't help but feel that unease creep back in. Whatever was out there wasn't human, and I'm glad I left before I found out what it wanted. A couple of years ago, I took a temporary job on a farm in a rural area. The owner, a man named Samuel, needed help after his previous worker left unexpectedly. Pay was decent, and I thought a few weeks of manual labor might be a nice change of pace. The farmhouse sat at the center of acres of farmland, with nothing but silence and empty fields stretching to the horizon. Samuel was quiet but polite. He mentioned only one rule: don't go near the old barn on the far edge of the property. I thought it was strange, but I didn't question it. Maybe it was unsafe or filled with tools he didn't want anyone touching. My first few days were uneventful. I worked on the main crops, fed the animals, and helped repair fences. But I couldn't help noticing that Samuel always seemed tense, especially when the sun started to set. He would pace near the windows, looking out toward the fields, as if expecting someone or something. On the fourth night, I was walking back from the shed when I heard a faint sound. It was coming from the direction of the old barn. almost like a whistle or someone humming a melody. I stopped and stared into the darkness, but I didn't see anything. I went back inside and didn't mention it to Samuel. The next morning, I asked him why the barn was off limits. He hesitated before saying it was abandoned and not safe to enter. But his tone told me there was more to the story. Later that day, I saw him standing near the edge of the property, staring toward the barn. He stayed there for almost an hour before walking back to the house without saying a word. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. Samuel had gone into town and I decided to check out the barn. I told myself it was just to satisfy my curiosity, nothing more. The path to the barn was overgrown and unused, and as I got closer, the faint humming sound started again. This time, it was unmistakable, soft, melodious, and almost human. The barn was old, with rotting wood and broken windows. The door creaked open easily. Inside, the air felt heavy, and the humming seemed to echo, though I couldn't see anyone. As I stepped further in, I noticed something odd. Marks on the ground, like someone had dragged heavy objects across the dirt. There were also small, crudely made figures hanging from the rafters, almost like scarecrows, but much smaller. Suddenly I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around expecting to see Samuel, but no one was there. The barn felt oppressive and I decided to leave before I got caught. As I turned to leave, I saw a shadow move at the far end of the barn. I didn't wait to investigate. When Samuel came back that night, he knew I had been there. He didn't yell or get angry. Instead, he looked at me with a mixture of fear and pity. Then he said, "I told you not to go there for a reason." He explained that for years, strange things had happened around the barn. Workers would leave without explanation, animals would go missing, and at night he'd hear voices. He had tried to lock it up and forget about it, but something always seemed to draw people toward it. The next day, I packed up and left. Samuel didn't try to stop me. I later heard from someone in town that the farm had been abandoned shortly after I left. Samuel disappeared, and no one knows what happened to him. To this day, I can still hear that humming when I think about the farm. I don't know what was in that barn, and I don't want to know. Whatever it was, it wasn't meant to be disturbed.